Hi, I'm Jeffrey Long, and welcome to my masterclass. Hey, everybody, we're going to give this a shot. I'm recording the slides that I would usually be giving you in person, the slides in the lecture, and I'm going to try and compile all this together into one big video and one video per lecture, and we'll see if this works. So, thank you for joining me. I hope you guys are okay. I know this sucks, but yeah, we're going to do the best we can together, right? Cool. Okay, so welcome. This is the first part of the Transmedia Storyworlds lecture, or Transmedia 101, or Overcoming Transmedia Resistance with Narrative Design for Fun and Profit. So, first off, when we talk about transmedia, and transmedia is a big part of this whole idea of transmedia story worlds, right? So, when we talk about transmedia, it's not a noun. Some people, bandy this about, really carelessly, right? But it's not a noun. It's an adjective, right? So, when we talk about transmedia, we're talking about something that flows across multiple media platforms, right? So, from books to comics to TV shows to movies and back, that sort of thing. Now, that means that there are multiple types of transmedia experiences, such as transmedia marketing, transmedia activism, and what we're going to be talking about, transmedia storytelling. And this act that we're going to be working on here, this project, is developing a story world that will flow across multiple media, therefore a transmedia story world. Now, but we got to take a step back for a second, because the term transmedia itself was coined by Marcia Kinder, who was a professor at USC in 1993 in this book, Playing with Power. What she was talking about when the book came out was really the kind of TV shows that I grew up with, right? So Transformers, G.I. Joe, Masters of the Universe, especially Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Muppet Babies, right? So those sorts of properties that really blossomed because of a change in the way that the law treated what was considered a TV show and what was considered an advertisement, right? So what that means is back then we started having cartoons that were basically created by the toy companies like Transformers, G.I. Joe, those sorts of things. And these extended ads that basically were stories, right? Um, the idea that Marcia realized was that this was a transmedia property, not necessarily a transmedia story, but a transmedia property, because you would have not just Saturday morning cartoon shows about things like Transformers, but also comic books and tie-in novels and eventually movies and things like that, right? So it was a transmedia property, but it wasn't necessarily a transmedia story. The idea of transmedia storytelling came along much later, and that term was created by Henry Jenkins in 2006 and really codified in this book, Convergence Culture. So, according to Henry, transmedia storytelling unfolds across multiple media platforms, with each new text making a distinctive and valuable contribution to the whole. Um, this is happening everywhere right now, largely because of what's known as vertical integration. Right? So, at a major corporation like Disney, now you have one big corporation with multiple branches inside of it. One for publishing, like Marvel Comics, one for TV shows like Hulu or ABC, one for movies, Disney Studios, and now increasingly another one for streaming like Disney Plus, and maybe another one for location-based experiences, like especially at Disney, theme parks and things like that. What used to happen was you would have this one IP, intellectual property owner. If it was a toy, it was usually like the toy company itself, like Hasbro or Mattel. And they would basically do these sort of licensing deals with a publishing partner or a TV partner and a book partner, and so on and so forth, right? So you have one book partner, one comic book partner, one TV partner, maybe one movie partner, maybe one video game partner. And in each case, each one of those partners basically brought a large sack of cash to the original IP owner and said, here, take our money, let us have the rights to make books, TV shows, comic books, whatever, based on your property. And the IP owner would say, "Thank you very much for your money. Go with God." And there was very little coordination between those different licensors and licensees, and especially between the multiple licensees, in order to establish a consistent story experience across all of them. Right? What changed was when Disney and other mega corporations like Disney began to bring all that stuff in house, right? Either through creation of a new division or acquisition of some existing company like Disney buying Marvel. Um, the powers that be realized that it was much more powerful for them to coordinate audience behaviors, right? So to basically design audience behaviors that would flow across multiple media and to keep them engaged with their particular properties much, much longer, right? So this has grown into what we call entertainment as a service, right? So when we start seeing things like Disney Plus, it's only a matter of time before we start subscribing, maybe not necessarily to Disney Plus, but to have like a smaller, leaner package that is just all of Star Wars, right? And so that subscription might include the comics from Marvel, it might include the TV shows on Disney Plus or on Hulu or ABC or whatever. It might include the games that are created, for Disney by whichever division they are currently running, and so you might then have like a different drop of content week to week to week to week to week to keep your audience engaged, right? Um, One of the kind of general rules of thumb is that it is 7 times harder to acquire a new customer than it is to keep an existing one, right? So instead of investing so heavily in acquiring new audiences, what Disney is most likely to do, and other companies like Disney are likely to do, is to develop that sort of ongoing relationship with their fans and with their particular audiences in order to keep them engaged. So when we see that a major company figures out that instead of just doing one-off licensing deals, they can instead create this sort of ongoing subscription model for much more money in the long run. That's why you start to see this shift towards unified transmedia ready story worlds, right? So a world that doesn't necessarily support just one story or just one movie, but entire franchises or sub franchises, something like Star Wars. Another thing that's happening is as all media become digital and things go increasingly online through things like the DC Universe subscription service or Disney Plus, these kinds of media experiences will become increasingly interconnected, right? So if you go on Disney Plus right now, you will see that there are plenty of TV shows, there are plenty of movies. You can go into a section that is specifically for Marvel, go into another section that's specifically for Star Wars. If you go on DC, you will see, or the DC universe, you will see that you can read Batman comic books and watch Batman TV shows and watch, Batman movies and so on and so on and so on and so on. But what very few of them have done very well yet is to be able to thread those kinds of experiences together through one connected platform. Um, we know this is coming. We know that this is sort of a holy grail experience that a lot of us have been experimenting with in the entertainment and technology industries for, 20 years more. But we know that, especially given what's happening right now with everybody having to rely more increasingly on streaming services and internet services, during this coronavirus scare, then we are going to see that kind of experience design, happening more and more and more deliberately. So that when you finish one episode of the TV show and that next part of that next part of that story picks up in a comic book, it might not prompt you to, do you just want to go on and auto stream the next episode of the TV show, but it might say, would you rather watch the next episode of the TV show or do you want to read this comic book, right? And it's that kind of experience design that this kind of class and this kind of project is designed to get you ready to create as this next generation of storytellers. Now, the other reason why you guys are the next generation of storytellers is because I'm sort of a transmedia immigrant. If we talk about digital natives and digital immigrants, The digital natives are folks that grew up with the internet and digital technology ever since they were born, right? Um, Guys like me, I was there when all this stuff got started, right? So those original licensing days, the kinds of properties that Marcia Kender was talking about, that was my childhood. So for me, I could um, see this stuff coming, but I never took it for granted. I saw it as a design challenge, right? For a bunch of you folks grew up with stuff. It's almost like a pre-Pokemon and post-Pokemon, kind of an environment, right? Pokemon really dropped when I was in high school, so I was just a little bit too old for Pokemon. Um, but Pokemon is very much a transmedia native property. You had the manga, you had the TV shows, you had the video games, the card games, all these things that really add up to something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And the coordination between those parts, you could sort of see this kind of coming together in early Pokemon forms. So when you grew up with this stuff natively, and when you grew up with internet that is relatively high speed, streaming platforms, things like that, as opposed to little postage stamp sized videos on web pages, the kind that I knew when I was in college. Yes, college. Um, it's that difference in how you think about the world that indicates whether this is something that's strange to you or it's something that makes total sense. Yeah. So, what has stood in our way so far from having this become sort of universally accepted has been mostly corporate structures, right? So the fact that you do have mega corporations like Microsoft and Disney, where the divisions aren't necessarily set up to coordinate with one another, but set up frequently to compete with one another. Um, that's when you start to have these disjointed experiences across multiple media, and your audiences are kind of left scratching their heads. So now that this stuff is becoming increasingly commonplace, and you start to have increasing percentages of the revenues for these companies coming from platforms like Disney Plus, this is going to be the new normal, um, and it's having some growing pains, mostly from people, not from technology, but mostly from people. Um, but make no mistake, this is where all this is going. So when I first started looking at this, when I left MIT and joined Microsoft back in 2007, 2010, something like that, what I was looking at was the series of case studies, right? So I was trying to determine whether or not this transmedia behavior of following something from one media platform to another was just nerd media, right? So like Star Wars nerds, Star Trek nerds, all of us have done this forever. So like for trekkers to go and follow the Star Trek universe from the TV show into the feature films and then into the next gen TV show and all the way through these tie-in novels and things, like all that stuff, native nerd behavior. But what you start realizing is that that kind of willingness to follow something from one property to another is less, it has less to do with just being a nerd and has more to do with being passionate about something. Now, true, that is sort of a hallmark of being a nerd, but you can be just as passionate about something like, big bands or sports, right? Fashion, things like that, so that you might follow a new TV show, week to week, but then tune into a podcast between regular episodes of that TV show, or watch arguably a behind the scenes or an after show kind of a show, like the after show that they had for The Walking Dead. It's still on TV, right? It's a different kind of TV show. But you could argue that the jump from the fictional episodes of The Walking Dead into the after show, The Talking Dead, is enough of a format shift to be considered a kind of transmedia experience. And that gets to an interesting point. The term transmedia is super fuzzy, right? This whole idea that as media become increasingly digital and increasingly interconnected, transmedia is going to just explode as the new normal. Uh, Honestly, like transmedia is a temporary word. Transmedia is just going to become media, right? Because as things become increasingly digital, something like the DC universe, where you can get digital comics and digital TV shows and digital games all through the same platform, is that still transmedia? Because it is all on your computer screen. Isn't a computer screen inherently a transmedia experience? What is the difference between a multimedia and a transmedia experience? Um, when I was in college, multimedia was like the new awesome. Like everything's gonna be multimedia, um, which is sort of true, and it did, right? It was like the New York Times online is now a multimedia experience because you can jump around from reading stories to watching videos to following recipes in the cooking section or doing an interactive version of the New York Times crossword puzzle. Yeah, it's multimedia, but it is still all the New York Times. So what does that then become? So the term transmedia is less to do with the medium itself that the thing is delivered in and more to do with the experience design, moving that one particular user from one media type of experience into another. One could argue that the internet itself, though the World Wide Web, is inherently a transmedia experience, right? And so it's that act of designing that user flow to go from one medium to the next that it becomes so critically important. And the design of a story world that supports those kinds of multimedia, multimodal, transmedia kinds of experiences, right? That's really the fine black magic, the dark art that you guys are going to be learning here over the next little bit. So, what we were observing, going back to the slides, what we were observing is that all of these kinds of franchises had transmedia experiences associated with them. So the Fable games, had the RPGs, but they also had tie-in light games like Coin Golf, American Girl dolls. They've always had this sort of transmedia experience to them because they've had tie-in books about the dolls that came bundled with the books from, or excuse me, came bundled with the dolls. Each one describing a different sort of historical period in time. They've been doing that for decades, right? Um, Wrestling is very much a transmedia experience. News is very much a transmedia experience. All these kinds of things are highly reliant on fans that are so passionate about it in order that it will make them overcome this sense of transmedia resistance. And we'll get back to that in a minute. Anywho, when I was looking at this, what I discovered was that there's so many of these things out there that transmedia at that point was already, there were over 500 IPs that I identified that could be considered transmedia, and there were more of these things growing all the time. And that was like 7, 8 years ago now, right? So, growing trend, how do we design for it? Let's go back to Henry's definition. So, if transmedia storytelling unfolds across multiple media platforms, with each new text making a distinctive and valuable contribution to the whole, well, what does that mean? It means that transmedia storytelling is an adaptation. One story being told in multiple media. So you have one version of The Hobbit that's told in the book, and another version of The Hobbit that's told in the movies, or one version of the Lord of the Rings that's told in the book, and another one's done in the movies. Anne of Green Gables has now been done to death, over and over and over and over and over again. Each one of those versions are independent versions of the same story, right? And so what that means is that they're adaptations. It's not one transmedia story with each chapter being told in a different medium. It's the same story being told over and over and over again. So simply retelling a story in a different type of media is not transmedia storytelling, but it's adaptation. The Matrix, and we'll get back to this in a little bit, The Matrix is very much a transmedia story because the Enter the Matrix video game was designed to slot in between the second and third Matrix movies when the Wachowski siblings were putting together their whole plan for that, right? It was designed, that franchise was designed very clearly to be a transmedia experience. Lord of the Rings is not. Lord of the Rings was just a set of feature films that were designed to adapt the existing story by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, so what does it mean to make a distinctive and valuable contribution to the whole? It has to be something that changes the way that you understand the story world, right? It adds to how you understand it. A Star Wars novel like Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader, this may help you understand the motivations of the character. It may help you understand a period of time in that character's life. A Star Wars serial is really only going to add inches to your waistline, right? That is not a distinctive and valuable contribution to the whole. Now, when you start looking at this, a traditional story, especially in Hollywood movies, it might be told across 3 movies. A transmedia story might begin in a cartoon and then go on into a movie, go back into cartoons, again into another movie, into a video game, back into a third movie, then on into another video game, which, not coincidentally, is precisely the pattern that the Matrix franchise wound up taking as it was developed. Now, the first thing that came to market was the original Matrix movie, right? And then they planned for all this other stuff, like the series of animated shorts that eventually got bundled together as the Animatrix. One of them was a animated prequel to the Matrix, and another one slotted in between the second or the first and the second movies. As I said before, the Enter the Matrix PlayStation and Xbox game was designed to go in between the second and third Matrix movies, and then the story continued on after the end of the third movie in this Matrix Online MMORPG, or massively multiplayer online role playing game. What happened in each one of these extensions was considered canonical. It was part of the overall story. And you had, as an audience member, a much better experience if you did all these different things. You could still understand the story if you only watched the three movies, but you had a much better experience if you experienced all this stuff put together. That's the art of additive comprehension, right? So that the things that you learn in the extensions, the additional components beyond just the original movie, are referred to as transmedia extensions. The things you learn in the cartoons or the things you learn in the console game, they transform a bunch of the stuff that you would otherwise have experienced more passively in the core central movies themselves. That's additive. It adds to your understanding or comprehension, hence additive comprehension. So, when we start looking at this stuff, there's two ways of looking at, or two schools of thought, I guess I should say, about transmedia development. And these were, this whole concept started as a joke by the late Brian Clark and his frequent partner in crime. Um, and this is detailed in the book A Creator's Guide to Transmedia Storytelling by Andrea Phillips. And these two schools are basically named after East Coast and West Coast rap. So the long-standing like feud or war between East Coast rap and West Coast rap. This is where the guys were kind of um, riffing on that as this joke of this deep war between the different schools of thought in transmedia. It was total baloney. But it was interesting insofar as they sort of had a point. So Brian Clark and Steve Peters pointed out that you could divide the way that transmedia storytelling was beginning to shape up as either West Coast or Hollywood style transmedia storytelling, which would usually include multiple big pieces of media, things like feature films, TV shows, comic books. This is very Disney, very Star Wars, very Marvel Cinematic Universe kinds of storytelling. So it was grounded in big business commercial storytelling. These stories are interwoven, but lightly. This is changing, right? The extensions or the coordination, especially now with the Marvel Cinematic Universe shifting more directly into Disney Plus, or the Star Wars, now relying more heavily on things like The Mandalorian for the future of its storytelling. This is becoming more and more tightly bound together. But mostly, for the most part, each one of these things can be consumed on their own, right? So you can watch The Mandalorian without ever having watched any of the Star Wars movies. You might not have anywhere near as high of an appreciation for the story that's happening if you hadn't seen the original Star Wars movies to understand who or what the child is, right? But you could still enjoy it. This is in contrast to more East Coast, more East Coast kinds of transmedia storytelling, which is actually drawing much more from things like alternate reality games, right? Alternate reality games, marketing campaigns, interactive theater, and this stuff comes largely from Broadway, right? So the kinds of emerging interactive theater, sort of stuff like Sleep No More, alternate reality games and marketing campaigns that came out of like Wall Street and New York, right? That's why it's called the East Coast. Now most of this stuff happened more online, right? So much more web-centric, more independent film, theater, interactive art, heavy use of social media. Now, a lot of these alternate reality games, and we'll come back to this idea of what an alternate reality game is, but a lot of this drew more heavily on kind of experimental theater, the sort of the happenings of the 1960s, things like that. But they were the kind of things that would really only happen once, right? The Marvel Cinematic Universe you can experience over and over and over and over and over again. But the kind of alternate reality game like Why So Serious for The Dark Knight, the Heath Ledger Batman movie, um, really only happened once in the lead up to the premiere of that film, right? So if you missed it, you missed it. You'll never get to experience that one again. Um, and a lot of those kinds of experiences, yeah, you'd have to follow along as that experience jumped from a live happening to a webisode series, to maybe a newspaper article that got pushed out. And the only way that you would understand it is if you experienced each of these pieces in sequence, right? So that's where this difference between West Coast and East Coast media comes down. Now, there's something interesting about that though, which is whether a East Coast style transmedia experience flows from a YouTube channel to a website to a YouTube channel to a website on a Twitter back to another website on into Twitter again, which is very common as an experience pattern for alternate reality games, or a West Coast experience, which is much more like a Hollywood movie. These things have something very obvious in common when you look at them plotted out that way, and that something is actually those little blue arrows, right? The experience of motivating an audience to jump from one medium to the next is the art of transmedia. It's that connection between them. It's the motivation and the reward for jumping from one medium to the next, right? And here's a dirty little secret. It doesn't really matter whether you're trying to get somebody to jump from a cartoon to a movie to a cartoon to a movie to a video game to a movie to a video game, or if you're just trying to get somebody to go from movie to movie to movie to movie to movie to movie to movie, like, oh, I don't know, say one of the largest Hollywood franchises in cinematic history, right? That experience design is pretty much exactly the same. The art of designing those little blue arrows, that transmedia experience is largely the same. What you're trying to do is to create this sort of four-step experience: discover, collect, consume, react, right? Discover, collect, consume, react. Discover, collect, consume, react. Um, First, you have to discover, or you have to design the discover stage, right? So how does your audience find your transmedia story? How will they first discover that each piece of that story exists? How will the end of one chapter in one medium point to the beginning of the next chapter in another medium? How will they then collect it? Right? How do they acquire each step in that story? Are they required to go to a different kind of vendor? Are they required to go to a different website? Are they required to go to a different store? Or are they able to collect them all digitally? And if they do collect them all digitally, what is that experience like? Can they get everything on Amazon? Can they get everything through your subscription service like Disney Plus or the DC Universe? How are you going to do it? What is that kind of acquisition experience like? And then, what are you expecting of them when you ask them to experience this? What are you asking of them, or what are you assuming they can do when you're planning for them to consume it, right? So, what kind of a familiarity with that given medium can you expect from that audience? Like video games, right? You put a video game out there, like, are you expecting your audience to have that particular platform? Are you expecting them to have it on their phone? Are you expecting them to know how to play a video game with a controller with 32 buttons, right? What kind of media literacy are you assuming once you are putting that in part of your plan? So yeah, what kind of hardware and software ownership is it reasonable to expect for something? When Lost, the TV show, was on the air, they had a tie-in game for the Xbox 360, and the video game itself was about $60. A Xbox 360 was about $300. You could, for $360, either acquire both the hardware and the software necessary to experience Lost via Novus, or you could buy the entire series up to that point on DVD for, I think it was like either $360 or less than $360, right? So that one experience had better be damn rewarding if you're expecting somebody to pay just as much for your one little video game tie-in as they might have invested in buying the entire TV show of like 22 episodes apiece for multiple seasons, right? So start doing that calculus in your head when you start making those sort of demands on your audience. And finally, react, right? Once they've done it, what do you expect them to do next? Now, a lot of the time, that kind of reaction is either go tell your friends, right? It's a sort of a spreadability moment, where you're trying to get turn your audience into its own kind of advertising channel, right? That's one way to go. Another way to go is to basically set it up so that you're in prompting them to experience the next part of this. Now, if it's in the same medium and it's as easy as having them just kind of lean back and ignore the buttons that pop up at the end of a Netflix episode, so they just go ahead and binge the next one, that's easy. If what you were trying to get them to do is to overcome that hurdle to go from TV shows into comic books, well, you've got to figure out how they're going to get there, right? You got to figure out how you're going to prompt them to go and, lo and behold, discover that next step of the transmedia experience. And what you see then is it becomes a loop, right? So discover, collect, consume, react, discover, collect, consume, react, discover, collect, consume, react. It sounds like a train picking up steam, right? And that's sort of true, because the more times that your audience goes through this, the deeper engaged they become with your property, with your story world. So if you can get somebody to really fall in love with this thing, discover, collect, consume, react, discover, collect, consume, react, discover, collect, consume, react, they are much more likely to go on and continue to engage with your story world, which is, as a narrative designer, is precisely what you want to do. So yeah, discover, collect, consume, react. The problem with this is, as I sort of mentioned, there's an inherent problem or inherent trouble with transmedia, which is resistance, right? So Henry talks about this idea of audiences of transmedia story worlds really being hunters and gatherers, right? So if you have a fan of a Star Wars TV show and there is a Star Wars tie-in novel that they are inclined to go and collect, right? They've got to go out, discover that it exists, go to a store and collect it, or order it on Amazon. Go through and spend all the time to consume it, and then keep that cycle going, right? You can design it like, well, for starters, you can do the old school way of doing it, not design it at all, and just wish them good luck. Or you can take a much more of a designer's approach, or a game designer's approach, and to make that discover, collect, consume, react four-step process something that is itself something that is highly enjoyable, right? If you start thinking about it like a game and like a meta experience that should be designed and should be pleasurable, then you're much more likely to keep your audience engaged with your property. Long story short, philosophically speaking, I subscribe to Ben and Jerry. If it's not fun, why do it, right? So you gotta make this experience fun. The other problem is that this is not an achievement you ever want to see, right? So when if I am telling you, it's like, oh yeah, the whole Star Wars universe, it's spectacular. The thing you've really got to understand is that this particular story starts out in this particular movie, then it goes on into these particular books, and oh yes, if you haven't read the storyline that ran between 1998 and 1992, blah 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 blah, right? This is the kind of face you get from people. They look at you like you're nuts. So how do you start making these kinds of experiences easier, right? How can you say this whole experience, the whole Matrix thing, it's so much better if you understand the third movie so much better if you only just play the video game and watch the Animatrix prequel, blah, 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 right? It's like, how can you make it easier? People are fat. People are lazy. People don't want to do work. You've got to make it into something that is a game. You have to overcome this inherent resistance, right? This is my mom. So my mom is way cooler than I am, and hopefully these videos never find their way to her, so I would never admit this to her. But my mom is way cooler than I am because she was in a Buffy the Vampire Slayer before I ever was. When Buffy the Vampire Slayer first came out, I thought the whole concept was ludicrous. And to be fair, it is. But Mom loved Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so when the show went off the air, Mom was sad. And then it came back with comic books, right? So to go from the TV show into the comic books were the canonical extension of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer story, right? So you would think that my mom would love reading these comic books. There's only one problem. So all all, all resemblances aside, um, the comic book guy and the legendarily, dark, dank, dusty, nasty comic book shop of legend, right? It's not something I'd ever want to subject my mother to, much less knowing how hard it is to even find a comic book shop in rural Ohio where my parents live, right? Now, this is changing. My mom can now download issues of the Buffy comic online, right? Or she could order trade paperbacks through Amazon. Those are ways of decreasing this idea of transmedia resistance. Think of comic book guy as transmedia resistance. He is the the monster that you have to overcome in order to get the treasure, right? So how can you design this experience to be so awesome that even fighting the monster is cool, and the reward that you get for defeating the monster is enough of a payoff to warrant that kind of labor, right? So, how do you do that? In like physics, resistance is overcome by decreasing friction and or increasing energy. Transmedia resistance is overcome by making things easier and or making people excited, right? So discover, collect, consume, react. You decrease friction by making things either easier to discover, collect, consume, react, or you increase the energy by making people excited to discover, collect, consume, react, right? This is where this idea of transmedia aesthetics comes in. So aesthetics is really the study of beauty, right? Um, when you look at a beautiful game, it is a game that flows on and on and on. Well, actually, it's the idea of flow as a beautiful experience, right? If something is beautifully designed, then the experience of playing that game, reading that book, watching that TV show, basically having that experience associated with it is itself highly frictionless. It is painless. It is engaging. The flow state that you get into is fantastic. When you look up and suddenly you realize you just binged an entire season of Castlevania, or you look up and it's 2 a.m. and you had to finish your book, right? Even though you should have been asleep hours ago. That's the kind of experience you're trying to design. You're trying to design a transmedia experience that will keep people so deeply engaged that anything else that they have to do falls away, and you've created this fantastic kind of experience for them. So, these different kinds of aesthetics, of a sense of transmedia aesthetics, a beautiful transmedia experience, there are a set of tools that you can use in order to design those kinds of experiences that will either decrease friction or increase energy and thus overcome the inherent transmedia experience or transmedia resistance in any kind of transmedia experience. And so these are the 10 that we're going to be talking about here in the next couple of lectures, right? Unique franchise characteristics, world as main character, resonant simple story myths, extensible character design, fractal storytelling and extensible narrative architecture, additive comprehension, multiple experience pathways, leveraged engagement, leveraged affordances, and collaborative authorship, clear canons, and multiplicity. Okay? So these 10 things are going to be the big areas of focus that we're going to look at moving forward. Thank you very much. And you will find your assignments on the Moodle. Please do this first set of exercises that you see there. Upload them to the Moodle, and I shall grade them as quickly as I can, and then move on to the next video in the series of lectures. Thank you, everybody, and I'll be talking to you soon.